If you've scrolled on the internet or social media lately, you've probably seen the words alternative housing and affordable housing. Everything about housing being unaffordable. You may have even heard the words ADU, tiny house, and tiny home. And maybe you're wondering, are people just using different words for the same thing? Well, spoiler alert, they're different but have similarities too. My name's Erin, and on this channel, I teach you all about ADUs and tiny homes. I'm a real estate agent passionate about affordable and alternative housing. By the end of the video, you're going to know the difference between a tiny house, a tiny home, and an ADU. A tiny house, by definition, is a structure that's under 400 square feet. That's not a lot of square footage. A tiny house might be on a permanent foundation, or it could be on wheels. A tiny house on wheels is going to be treated as a movable, like a vehicle. 2018, the International Building Code actually updated their information to include tiny houses. So tiny houses actually have their own section. Tiny houses on wheels have fewer regulations than the ones on a permanent foundation because they are movable. The International Building Code is going to be updated so that it can offer some clarification on what a tiny house is and offer more guidance on the safety and quality standards for the tiny houses on wheels. The thing about tiny houses is people love them for their mobility. You can take your home with you. Home is where you park. It also encourages things like minimalism, simplicity, and intentional living. You don't get a lot of space. You have to do the most you can with the space you have. Most people that move into a tiny house are gonna have to adopt some, if not all, the principles of minimalism. I've met so many people that live in tiny houses or the tiny house on wheels. I've actually got a video of my beautiful friend Ruha's tiny house. I'll link it here in the description. To me, tiny homes is a concept, and it's an umbrella for a lot of different things. To better understand what a tiny home is, you may want to see some examples. Tiny home could be an RV, an actual tiny house. Some people would use a yurt for a tiny home. Others have converted a van or maybe even a school bus into a tiny home. Some are using the shipping containers for living spaces as well. I've also seen tree houses, 3D printed houses, and even people converting sheds into tiny homes. The thing that I love about tiny homes is it's so eclectic. It's such a fascinating area to learn about. It's so cool to see the variety and the things that people come up with. Tiny homes in general may not meet that 400 square feet standard. They are going to be smaller though. It's more about the concept of tiny home versus the measurements or just square footage. If you put all of those tiny houses in a bucket, you would just call them alternative housing. Some people say affordable housing. Tiny homes can really cater to a lot of different lifestyles, and they usually offer a lot of flexibility. I've seen so many designs that are just kooky and eclectic and just maybe a little weird and fun at the same time. Most people consider tiny homes unconventional or non-traditional. Now let's talk about ADUs. What is an ADU? An ADU is a secondary dwelling unit on a piece of land that has a primary residence. An ADU might be a garage conversion. Some people add on to their property to create the ADU, and then others may just put an ADU in the backyard that's not attached to the house at all. Those that are adding an ADU to their property typically want it for rental income or even to offset their mortgage. Some need to house their elderly parents instead of putting them in a place like a nursing home or a medical facility. Others may just want to house a loved one or a college-age student. The thing about ADUs, they're permanent. They're not going anywhere. They're not on wheels. ADUs have certain building codes and ordinances to meet. Let's talk a little about those benefits. The benefits of an ADU, again, the income potential. You can rent it out. An ADU also gives you flexibility. If you need extra living space, it's so much easier to put an ADU in the backyard instead of selling your house and having to buy another one just to have maybe a space for an extra function, perhaps a home office or a home business. Real estate investors are seeing the beauty of an ADU and the opportunity that they provide, because adding an ADU to your property doesn't always guarantee an increase in property value, but it could. Places like California and other places that it's becoming popular are seeing 20, 30% increase in the home. That is huge for a real estate investor, especially during this market where the flip opportunities have kind of been watered down, if I'm being honest. So we know what a tiny house a tiny home and an ADU are, but what are the differences? If we're just putting a tiny house against an ADU, when is a tiny house an ADU and when is an ADU a tiny house? A tiny house is an ADU if it is on a property, it's a secondary dwelling unit. It's got to meet all the ADU building codes and the ordinances, which is based on where the ADU is. An ADU is a tiny house whenever it's under 400 square feet. So you can see there is overlap. The differences is where you really get to understand. An ADU is not going anywhere. It is permanent. A tiny house might be on a foundation, might be on wheels. Home sometimes is where you park it. The regulations for ADUs and tiny homes are also different. The regulations for ADUs will be based on where the ADU is built or added to the property. The regulations for tiny houses, on the other hand, kind of vary. If it's on wheels, we have a lot less regulations. If it's on a foundation, we do have building code, which is still a little bit gray. As far as how people are using an ADU versus a tiny house, an ADU is typically going to be for the income, for extra living space, or to house a loved one. A tiny house, on the other hand, people downsizing, people want to live more affordably, if they want to live more intentionally and simplistically, and then those who also want to adopt some of the minimalism principles. Other people love tiny houses because you can take it with you. So there you have it. You know the difference between a tiny house, a tiny home, and an ADU. I'd love to hear, did you actually know the difference before you watched this video? Let me know in the comments. If you found this video helpful, like, subscribe, shoot me some comments and questions. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.